Good morning to everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce the Mario Gerla Symposium. And this symposium is in honor of a professor, Mario Gerla. It was established by his family in 2019. Professor Mario Gerla was a professor of computer science at the UCLA and the ISSNAF founding member. And Dr. Gerla, I would call him a pioneer in our computer science area. He led the research focusing on the design, performance evaluation, and control of distributed computer communication systems and networks. And his early work focused on optimizing what would eventually evolve into the internet. And I remember being a student, I was already looking at these papers because he was already very well known at that time. And this research is really at the core of computer science and including computing systems and networks. So this award recognizes significant advances in computer science foundations and applications. Now, I like to thank the jury, and I would like to introduce them. In addition to me, we have a Professor Gesualdo Scutari, who is Professor of Industrial Engineering at Purdue University, and he carries out pioneering research in the area of data science and optimization. We have a Professor Anna Squiccerini, who is a professor at Penn State University, and their work is on privacy, security, and she also does a lot of research on social aspects and protection from bullying and other type of phenomenon happening on the web. At this point, I like to stop and introduce our first speaker. The presentation will be on alphabetic order, and I would like to remind the speaker to stay in there a lot of the time. So our finalist, our first finalist is Dr. Valeria Barra. She's a research software engineer at Caltech. So I leave the floor to Valeria to start the presentation. And I would like to remind the audience to ask a question in the chat.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction. I hope you see my full screen okay. So my name is Valeria Barra and currently work as a research software engineer at Caltech. I would like to thank ISSNAF for this symposium. So currently I work in the Climate Modeling Alliance, which is a large collaborative consortium project. So I would first like to acknowledge all of my collaborators before diving in my presentation. So CLIMA is a coalition of scientists, engineers, and applied mathematicians like me from Caltech, MIT, and the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We're building the first Earth system model in the Julia programming language that automatically learns from data to produce more accurate climate predictions with quantified uncertainties. This is a picture from early in the project. I only joined during the pandemic a couple of years ago, so no wonder I had to Photoshop myself in the group picture. So the motivation behind our work is that we all know right now that temperature have been rising in the past few centuries, but not all climate models have the same climate sensitivities. So there is some variation in the predictions of how our climate is going to change in the near future, let's say 50 or 100 years. Some of this variation might have discouraged some of the early interventions for climate mitigation and adaptations. And some of these variations might have been due to the fact that not all climate models resolve clouds faithfully in the same way, especially low reflecting clouds. But our model would like to improve on this. So how do we do this? Well, nowadays we have a plethora of data sources. This is an example of a constellation of satellites orbiting the Earth at every given moment. But the data gives us the present snapshot, the present picture of what happens in the current moment. but we can use this data to better inform our physical models. So what CLIMA is proposing is an Earth system model, sometimes also referred to as a digital twin. So we're trying to replicate or simulate the entire system of the Earth. You can imagine this is a very complex, large-scale, multi-scale, actually, multi-physics system. So if we look at the left picture here, we can imagine the schematic of an Earth system model being comprised of different components. So first, we have the atmosphere where all of our weather events happen. Then we have the land where the land hydrology happens, so the water cycle through rivers and lakes. And we also have the ocean, of course, which is a big component on our planet. And all of these models or components are connected to each other and they communicate. For instance, land communicates to the atmosphere through the land biosphere model, which represents how vegetation, plants, exchange quantities between the atmosphere and land, or for instance, the ocean biosphere or sea ice and land ice. So what CLIMA is proposing is to combine data simulation and machine learning tools to better inform the physical models in what is sometimes referred to as scientific machine learning approach. So the Earth system model will be grounded in physics using subgrid scale cloud resolving modeling and designed for automatic calibration and parameters using machine learning tools. So how we're going to do this? Well, you have to imagine that subdividing the entire Earth in computational cells could be very expensive if you want to resolve all the fine-grained scales, such as clouds. So traditional climate models, they subdivide the Earth in this, you can see these red blocks, these computational cells that are traditionally 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers wide. But there is a lot going on in a 100-kilometer square cell, so especially clouds and weather patterns. We all know that they change even just a few kilometers down the road. So what happens is that we have to make educated guesses of what happens inside of these computational cells. And basically parameterizations are the ones that help us define what happens inside of these cells. So one of these computational cells, like this red block here, is where we do high resolution, large eddy simulations, but we cannot do such fine-grained, large eddy simulations on the entire globe because that would be computationally expensive. So what we do is we use these LES simulations to inform the parameterizations for the global circulation model, so the one that describes the entire Earth. Which in turn can be used for large-scale forcings to force the LES. So we have some technical aims that we would like to achieve. We want to support both CPUs and GPUs using a common code base, open source, written in the high-level dynamic Julia programming language. Julia can be very familiar for especially early career researchers and students because its syntax is similar to Python and MATLAB, but can achieve also high performance as C and Python. Julia has an interactive REPL and it uses just-in-time compilation, which is triggered by the first evaluation of a function, and allows a sort of polymorphism via multiple dispatch that can happen at compile time or runtime, so it could be dynamic. Julia allows you to write generic code where the compiler will specialize on types of calling arguments. So for instance, if I have a function f on a argument x, which I can define to be an abstract array, then this abstract array could really be just an array of single precision floats or double precision floats, or even a CUDA array if you want to run on a GPU backend. And we want it to be accessible by a mixture of users and contributors because, again, as I mentioned, CLIMA is a very diverse, large consortium project. We also have some scientific aims. So for the atmosphere component, we want to support both large eddy simulations and general circulation models. So as I said earlier, imagine a Cartesian box domain or a spherical domain. We want to allow specification of governing equations and boundary conditions by the simplest modular building blocks that are our composing operators. We want to allow uniform and uniform structure meshes, and our model is differentiable, which will enable rapid development of new parameterizations and principal recalibrations of parameters after changes of the aromatics. This will be enabled by automatic differentiation and machine learning tools. So to meet these scientific goals, we're writing software. So it's really research enabling software, but it's also the other way around because it's software that is enabling research since this is computational science. So the way I see this is the perfect combination for the modern research software engineering, which is what it's my role in this group. So what I've been focusing on the most for the past year has been climacore.jl. So that is the dynamical core, or in short, DICORE of our model. So this provides the building blocks, the foundations of our discretizations of the governing equations for the physics of the atmosphere and land, which is a library or suite of tools for constructing flexible space discretizations. So for instance, we take care of the geometry. And as I said, we want to support different geometries, Cartesians and spherical. And for this, we also have to support different vector representations. So not only for Euclidean Cartesian vector spaces, but also covariant, contravariant basis. For the spatial discretizations of our partial differential equations, we support in the horizontal direction both continuous Galerkin and discontinuous Galerkin, and in the vertical staggered finite differences. Why continuous Galerkin, or I'm sorry, this is a schematic of the API. So these are the building blocks of the API. So starting here, we look at this right panel. From top to bottom is this hierarchy of objects. We start from a domain, which is the bounding box, and then the mesh is the one that knows about the resolution, so how many elements you want to use. Topology is the one that knows about the orientation and connectivity. And the space is really the mathematical function space. So you can define a spectral element space. For instance, if you want to use polynomial order 3, you would have 4 nodes along each edge and internally. And then a field is a mathematical field. So for each of these finite element nodes, the red dots here, you have a value associated. And here's a snippet of our code where we define each of these hierarchical objects. And then you can define the field and say with useful overloads, for instance, sum is a useful overload in Julia, where it tells you this is the integral of these fields over this space. Okay, so why we want to use spectral elements? Well, this brings me back to my postdoc project. I was a postdoc in the Center for Efficient Exascale Discretizations under the US Exascale Computing Project at the University of Colorado at Boulder in partnership with Lawrence Livermore National Lab and other national labs. So basically, we want to use not only spectral element representation, but in matrix-free form. Why? Well, if we look at the left figure here on the right panel, we see a model of performance that was valid until a couple of decades ago when we knew that Moore's law was still valid. So here on the y-axis, we measure a floating point operations per degrees of freedom. On the x-axis, we have polynomial order. And we can see that assembling a matrix, so that is the green and brown curves here, could still make sense, but just for a very low polynomial degree, which is 1 and 2. But if we look at the left panel, which is a more modern way of thinking of performance models, because this measures memory bandwidth, and we know that nowadays performance is not bottlenecked by arithmetic intensity, but by memory movement. So here on the y-axis, we have bytes per degrees of freedom, and we see that assembling the matrix has a skyrocketing price. So we want to use matrix-free representations where we only express the action of the operators, not assembling sparse matrices that are expensive to fetch data. And we see that the higher the order not only gives you a better, more accurate representation of your solution, but it also has a best memory bandwidth usage. Here on the right picture, you see some of the benchmarks that I ran in this project, where on the y-axis, we have a measure of throughput, which is mega degrees of freedom per second per conjugate gradient iteration. So this particular is a benchmark that uses a linear solve for a linear system. We see here that we reach on the y-axis almost 3 gigaflops per second in a fraction of a millisecond, and this was with GPU backend. So back to the current problem and current project at ClimaCore, these are some examples of applications that are useful in the atmosphere or ocean models. This is a shallow water equation suite that I worked on. So here are the equations of shallow water approximation, and you can see the left is the vector invariant form, the right is for curvilinear and orthogonal basis, and on the bottom here you see a snippet of our code. And Julia allows you to use Unicode characters, so it's really nice. I can define nabla to be the gradient operator and so on for the other operators. And you can see how simple and neat our interface is. You can really look at the math and look at the code and see that you're writing math in the code, which is pretty neat and especially attracts a lot of young students.
5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. These are some of the experiments that I ran for the shallow water equation suite. So these are test cases known in the atmospheric science literature that are used for validation. On the left here, you can see a zonal flow over an isolated mountain. On the right here, you can see barotropic instability test case. So these are large-scale simulations on the sphere, and our code is all open source. So you can see this is just where our code base lives on GitHub, so everybody could check it out. Lately I've been focusing more on stabilization, so especially for transport problems. So this is a transport problem where a little q denotes the tracer concentration. Transport problems that are purely advective with no artificial or physical dissipation mechanisms tend to have numerical instability issues, especially if discretized with spectral element operators, because the spectral element advection operator can be quite oscillatory. And this is due to a known Gibbs phenomenon. So how to mitigate this issue? Well, here's a test case with a slotted cylinder where it has these sharp gradients on purpose. And how to mitigate? Well, we can see here on the left where this simulation has some of these numerical spurious artifacts that are undesired because this lead to numerical instabilities. Well, on the right here, I use a flux limiter to mitigate these instabilities. Okay, some of the current performance optimization efforts. Well, Julia allows some optimizations. For instance, we can disable bound checking to facilitate vectorized SIMD instructions. We can ensure type stability using tools that allow to do static type checking. And we can try to eliminate dynamic memory allocation. So here on the left, you see some of the profiling pipeline that is included in our automated scaling test. So we have performance CI, so continuous integration in addition to regression tests and unit tests. Here on the right, you see an example of a flame graph where we do tracking allocation to reduce again or eliminate dynamic memory allocation. And we have ongoing support for GPU. So the parallelization strategies, currently we have a wrapper library that supports genetic distributed computing paradigms. So not only distributed memory, but also shared memory. Currently we use MPI-GL, which is a Julia wrapper for the MPI library. We have parallel IO support in NetCDF and HDF5 output formats. And we're adding currently GPU support. Here you see an example of a scaling results where on the y-axis we measure simulated years per day. So this is just the conclusion of my talk. I want to leave you with this. ClimaCore is the new open source core for the Clima's Preferred Earth System model, entirely written in the Julia dynamic language. I introduced ClimaCore's API for flexible discretizations and high-performance composable operators. I showed examples of applications for atmospheric flow and flux limiters to overcome oscillation challenges and numerical instabilities challenges. For future work, I personally like to work on some other stabilization methods, for instance, SUPG, and work on preconditioning and multigrid strategies. Here on the right, you see a simulation of a health Suarez test case in the atmosphere run for up to 180 days. So on the top here, you see the plotted quantity is energy. So you can see how in turn the temperature will vary. And at the bottom is the meridional velocity. So I would like to thank everybody for your attention, especially all our collaborators and our funders. I would like to thank ISSNAF for the opportunity to speak in this symposium. And of course, I would like to thank Professor Mario Gerla's family for honoring his legacy through this award. Thank you so much, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot. So we will have the question from the jury, and we will try to stay in 7 minutes. So, Aldo, do you want to start?
Sure. Yes, I have just a couple of questions, actually more a curiosity. The first one is more high level about the scope of the project rather than the specific implementation. Like you mentioned that, if I understand correctly, that one of the goals of the project is to bring AI or machine learning tools to inform basically the physical models, right? In order to maybe do calibration and so on. Can you just elaborate a bit more, like what kind of AI or ML tools, like you're changing, what is the effect of this on the physical model? I mean, if you can.
Yes, so that's not exactly my area of research, but I know that our team has models, for instance, in inverse Kalman ensemble models for this parameterization and calibration of parameters. So they do calibrate and then sampling, basically. So as I said, in the computational cell, they are so coarse, we cannot really see exactly what happens at the subgrid scale or the fun grid scale. So they have to estimate, and so that these parameters that, for instance, like water vapor or other quantities, can inform the physical system for the large-scale global model. Exactly.
Okay. Okay, yeah, just one last question, maybe more related to your work. Like you mentioned that basically you want to achieve this high performance computing, right? Through your software implementation. Can you elaborate a bit more how do you do that? In the sense that, I mean, I don't work at the level of the software, but at the level of the optimization, implementation of, for example, the equation that you mentioned, what do you do? How the parallelization happen? Like you are using CPU and GPU, right? So that can be, they can have completely different scale of performance. So like everything is synchronous, it's asynchronous, you are using memory lock. How do you push this? It's asynchronous. How do you really?
Correct. So we can have different, we want to allow for different threading like patterns and iterations. For instance, we can thread across blocks or also across subterms in our expression. So right now, for instance, each of these terms, it's what Julia is going to translate and materialize in the Julian lingo. But we also want to be able to vectorize across entire expressions. So where we update in block like one variables, and we want to update, for instance, across horizontal elements. So we call like this slabs of elements, or we want to do like computation by columns. Because
but you're synchronous, or you can allow to be asynchronous, like people, the shared memory is written and read at different times, so that you can have some kind of.
We can allow both.
These kind of things.
Yeah, we can allow both. And currently we're studying and we're evaluating and assessing some of these different paradigms to see which one is more convenient for our use cases. And also, so Julia, for instance, has native threading. So we can also use native threading in Julia to see what are the best strategies in our case. And some of the native like SIMD instructions via these macros. So Julia allows meta programming through these macros. For instance, the @inbound is the macros that tells the compiler, okay, don't do bound checking because on this expression, I'm pretty confident that I set the bounds correctly. So this, of course, could be a bit bug prone if you're not really sure, like if the programmer developer is not really sure about the bounds of given arrays or quantities. But there are some strategies that are like internal to the Julia language.
Have you already assessed any speed up? Any?
Oh, yes, definitely. So we're currently optimizing our code. So this is just like a very preliminary result, but we also have like GPU support going on, for instance. And for GPU, we're most likely going to use kernel abstractions.jl is a package developed by Valentine Shuravi at MIT Julia Lab. Basically is a wrapper library that allows you to write single source code that then can run both on GPUs and CPU, which is more actually a GPU code in quote that runs also on a CPU. So it will be more like GPU optimized in the near future.
Okay, Anna, do you have a question? Sorry to jump in, but we don't have much time.
No, I think this was, I had a question about the general scope of the project, but I understand, just a clarification more than a question, that you are mostly involved with the numerical methods underlying this differentially partial equation. And I guess a question for you was, how do you, you know, when these models are these models already out there, you know, from different disciplines, and you implement them in a way, or you know, formulate them, or how do you work on bridging that gap between the physical phenomenon that you're trying to model and your mathematical representation?
Right. So I should have mentioned that the Klima model is actually built from scratch. So we started from the ground up, like it's not using or reusing legacy code that often happens, especially in other climate models. So there are some codes that they've been developed for decades, especially in national labs in the United States. Sometimes they have to face the two language problems when, for instance, there are old legacy codes written in Fortran or C, and then they have to use other packages for like machine learning tools nowadays that are more modern. So actually the decision in Klima was to start from the ground up with this entirely new model written from scratch. And the decision was to use the Julia programming language, which solves the two language problem. So everything here was done from scratch since the beginning of this project.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a final question, very quick. So, based on your experience, which are the main limitations of this Julia programming language and its compiler?
So at this moment in time, I cannot find limitations, but I can only find like positive points, because Julia really allows this duality. So it allows for entry-level contribution. So it really attracts a lot of young talent. So students nowadays, they don't really want to learn C or Fortran anymore. So we have a lot of young students approaching our project because we use Julia. And also allows for high performance computing if people want to focus more on performance. So it can be both. So it's really the best of both worlds right now for scientific computing.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I think at this point, thank you. And we can move to our next speaker, who is Dr. Cremona from Laval University in Canada.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you to the Professor Gerla family for making this possible. So my research is about the development of novel machine learning methodologies for the analysis of functional data. So we'll talk about functional data in 1 minute. My work is highly multidisciplinary and collaborative. And actually almost all the methodology that I develop are motivated by some problem in omics research. So let me start telling you something about omics data. So by omics, we mean many different things. So we mean genomics, epigenomics, metagenomics, proteomics, etc. So during the past 15, 20 years, there was a lot of progress in sequencing technologies. And this actually allowed fast and relatively cheap sequencing of the genome. In this figure, you can see some of the modern sequencing methodology. For example, you can have whole genome sequencing to really sequence the genome and find the mutations in the genome. Or I will also talk about ChIP-seq methodologies. That is actually a technique to understand in which position the DNA interacts with different proteins. So all of these sequencing tools generates different type of omics data. The characteristic of all these omics data is that they are usually very complex, high dimensional, and they're usually very noisy. So it is pretty clear that this characteristic actually poses a lot of challenges for reliable analysis of these data and also for the interpretation of the results. So the main idea behind all my research is to treat these omics data at high resolution and representing them as curves along the genome, like the one that you see in the examples. We can also have something more complex, like two-dimensional surfaces or 2D heat maps over 3D space. So I will focus on the one-dimensional curve case. So what are functional data? Functional data are just a generalization of scalar and vector data. So instead of having just one measurement, like in scalar data, or a set of measurements, like in vector data, in functional data, we actually have one curve, so one mathematical function for each subject. So functional data analysis is the analysis of this type of data. So usually we think that these data, these functional data are smooth. But of course, in reality, we do not really measure the functional data itself. What we have are these small red dots. So we have observation of our functional datum on a grid, so on a discrete grid of points. And so this means that the first thing that we need to do is to actually go back and obtain the functional representation for this data. So we do this through smoothing, and this also helps us to alleviate the noise that we have in the measurements. Another problem that we always have in functional data analysis is that often the curves are not aligned. So the alignment step is very important, and we need to take that into consideration in all the methodology that we develop. So several machine learning methods have been generalized to functional data in the past few years. For example, in the unsupervised machine learning setting, we have principal component analysis, the functional version of principal component analysis, or we have functional clustering to find the clusters of curves based on their shapes. In the supervised setting, we have, for example, functional regression. That is a generalization in which the betas, instead of being just number, they are function themselves or surfaces. So my research aimed to develop other methodology in this context to analyze this type of functional data. And importantly, even if my research is always motivated by omics research, actually the methodology are pretty general, so they can be applied to any type of data, not only to omics data. And about this, let me tell you a little bit about one recent project I worked on that is beyond omics data. So what we did a couple of years ago was to use different type of machine learning methods for functional data to study the curves of COVID-19 mortality in the 20 Italian regions. So this is for the first wave of COVID-19 in Italy. We were able to also study the relationship between these mortality curves with different socio-demographic infrastructure and environmental variables. Right now, we are finalizing a follow-up work that is looking at differences between the first and the second wave of COVID-19 in Italy, again using these functional data analysis tools. So going back to omics research, I have to say that in omics research, application of functional data analysis are still pretty rare. But a couple of years ago, I published a paper on the journal Bioinformatics to give an overview of functional data analysis in computational biology and in bioinformatics. And here we actually identified 3 different research directions in which the functional data were already used and proved to be effective. Actually, my work is in these first 2 directions. So I will now talk about the shapes of the epigenome and the shape of the genomic landscape. So in the shape of the epigenomes, the curves, so the functional data, are usually at single nucleotide resolution along the genome, like the one that you see over here. So each of these rows represent one curve, so one particular omic experiment. In this type of data, we are often interested in analyzing, in studying these peaks that you see in this picture. For example, these peaks can tell us about the presence of an interaction between the DNA and the protein. So in one of my work, I employed the shape information embedded in these curves to cluster these curves, so to cluster the peaks. And I was able to prove that different shapes are actually related to different biological complexes, to different protein complexes that are interacting with the DNA. In the shape of the genomic landscape direction, in this case, we consider a large number of genomic landscape features at very high resolution along the genome. So this means that we actually consider many different types of omics data at the same time. So here the idea is again to really consider the shapes of this functional data to extract all the information that we can from this data. So the objective can be to find the recurrent patterns or to contrast different type of genomic regions in different parts of the genome. So in this context, I recently developed a probabilistic mean with local alignment that is a clustering technique that is able to cluster misaligned curves looking only at looking at the curves locally. So basically what we do is a local probabilistic clustering of these curves. And this helps us to solve the problem of functional motif discovery, which is the problem of finding repeated patterns with noise, of course, in a set of curves, or also patterns that are repeated within the same curve. So, for example, the red pattern over here, you can see that it is repeated a little bit differently in many different curves. So this is one of the functional motifs that we want to discover. So my methodology takes idea from functional data analysis, bioinformatics, and fuzzy clustering to actually find, to actually discover these functional motifs. And I have to say that at the beginning, we know nothing about these motifs. So the user only needs to say what is the minimum length and the maximum length he's interested in. And then everything else is learned from the data. So the shape itself, the level of noise, and the level of noise, everything, and also, sorry, the length of the motifs, everything is learned from the data. So I employ these methods to study mutagenesis, that are the processes that generate mutation in the DNA sequence, and that are related to several diseases, for example, to cancer. So that's why it is important to understand how this mutation can rise and where we can have these mutations. So the idea here was to look at mutation rates profiles at very high resolution along the genome, and try to see if there are signature shapes, so functional motifs within these curves. So we actually considered hot regions that are regions where we already knew that there are high mutation rates on average, and we were interested in really learning repeated patterns at a smaller scale. So in this case, we were able to find different motifs. And importantly, we were able to associate each of these functional motifs to different genomic landscape, so also to different biological meaning. In another project, I employed functional hypothesis tests and regression methods to study the effect of non-BDNA in the genome. So non-BDNA are a different type of very weird three-dimensional structure that the DNA can have, and that are different from the usual double helix we are used to think of for the genome. The idea here is that we can consider regions of the genome where we have or we might have this weird three-dimensional structure, and compare these regions to motif-free regions. So control regions in which we have nothing, so in which we should have the usual double helix. So one of the methods that I use to perform this comparison is IW-tomics, so interval-wise testing for omics data. that is a testing procedure for functional data that is able to test for differences between two groups of curves, but it is also able to find the specific location and scales at which we actually see these differences. So we were actually able to prove that these non-BDNA have a different effect, like increasing the polymerization speed, and importantly, increasing sequencing error and increasing mutation rates. So as I already mentioned, all these functional data analysis methods that I develop are pretty general, so they can be applied to a variety of data. So here is another example in which I employed exactly the same methodology to a completely different problem. So in this case, we were interested in studying transposable elements that are jumping genes, so segment of the genome that can move from one place to another of the genome. And in this case, we actually consider many genomic features at very high resolution, and we use functional regression and functional hypothesis test to build models for the integration and the fixation of these elements in the genome. Okay. So
yeah, I think that we need to wrap up.
Yes, yes, this is my last slide. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, with this I just stop here. So I hope I was able to convince you that machine learning methods for functional data are actually very useful in omics research. And these are all the people that I need to thank, in particular Francesca Chiaromonte and Caterina Makova from Penn State University, who were my great mentor for my postdoc at Penn State. And I need to thank my university, Université Laval, and the NSERC for the funding. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And now we have the question by the jury. Anna, do you want to start with a quick question?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I can ask. I have a relatively high level question. I think I saw that you are basically showing how you apply this large scale statistical methods for different domains and using different techniques. But I guess a question for you would be, can you elaborate on some of the most meaningful applications where you've seen use of the work you've done so far?
Well, I think so. In general, functional data analysis is used a lot in biomedical research, not a lot on omics research. Among my work, I think one of the most important one is the thing that I was showing you here. So about the studying of the effect of this non-BDNA. Because what we were able to see is actually that this weird three-dimensional structure causes a lot of errors going on. So basically, whenever we have this function, this structure, we actually have a lot of mutations in the genome. So we were actually able to look at this genome-wide and being able to understand a little bit how these mutations work and why we have them.
Thank you. Aldo, do you have a question?
Yes, just a couple of quick questions. The first one is that you are talking about the functional analysis and the use of technique. At the beginning, you said that you work, your tools or your models can be applied to several problems, right? So did you develop new models in the context of functional analysis, or you were using existing techniques and approach to the specific problems?
Both. So the technique I was showing you here are techniques that I developed. So this probabilistic k-mean with local alignment is something that I developed, and also the high-W tomics is something that I developed.
These are parametric or non-parametric? These are parametric.
Non-parametric.
So how did you solve it? So because it's an infinite dimensional problem, right?
Yeah, exactly. It is an infinite dimensional problem. So the main trick usually is that after you use smoothing, so after you obtain your functional datum, you actually obtain a functional data on a basis representation. So
it's
you
like a
either use
kernel-like
a
approach.
time basis or
Kind of
kernel,
kernel.
or yeah, exactly. So that's the main trick.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Aldo, do you have other questions?
No other question.
Okay, yes, I have a different question. So usually when applying those statistical tools, do you apply them to very large data sets? And if so, do you use a parallel programming techniques or what do you use to speed up the computation?
Yeah, so I usually program in R because of all the statistical packages that are available there. And we know that R is not very efficient from a computational point of view. So in this application, we actually have genome-wide data. So these are big data. The genome is like more than 3 billion points. So the computational aspects are an issue here. So one of the things that we do is sometimes we write the core of the R function in C++, so that the computation can go faster, even if they are wrapped in R. And other times we parallelize. So like in this interval-wise testing, for example, often we have to test a lot of different omics regions, and they are a lot of different omics data, and each of them they are independent, so we can actually do them. It's like an embarrassing parallel problem here. Okay, thanks. I don't have other questions, so I don't know if we can move to our next speaker. So, okay, thank you a lot, Marzia, for the interesting presentation. So our third finalist is Dr. Michele Polese, who is at Northeastern University. So Michele, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Elisa, for the very kind introduction. And really thanks everyone for giving me this chance to be here and to present the research that I've been doing since I started my research career in 2016, and in particular since I moved to Boston in 2020. So the title of this talk is Next Generation Wireless Networks with Open and Intelligent Spectrum Systems. And in the next 15 minutes, I'll try to give you a very high-level motivation and vision of why I'm doing this research behind open and intelligent spectrum systems. And then I'll focus on 3 specific studies that I did in the last couple of years in this area. So, okay, we're all aware about the role that wireless networks play in our daily lives, right? We are basically, right now, we are connected over Zoom, probably from a laptop that is using Wi-Fi or from a smartphone that is using a cellular connection. At the same time, we also rely daily on weather prediction, and climate is changing. So it becomes more and more important to track climate and weather phenomena, like Dr. Barra was saying earlier, right? So what do these 2 applications, wireless networks and weather and climate sensing, have in common? They have in common the fact that they use the same but shared limited resource, the wireless spectrum. So wireless networks of course, for wireless communications, and climate sensing for passive and active RF sensing. Actually, there's many more applications that use the wireless spectrum. And this is an example. This is the frequency allocation table for the United States. And you have applications that go from TV broadcasting to, again, wireless networks, to radio astronomy and Earth exploration and sensing. And a common trait among all of these services is that they often need more spectrum than they have. You're probably familiar with why communication needs more spectrum. So this is a simplified version of a Shannon capacity equation. And you see that it is basically proportional to the bandwidth that you use in your system. So we were asking ourselves, what does it take to reach a rate of 1 terabit per second? And with meaningful number of MIMO channels and modulation orders, you often need more than 10 gigahertz of bandwidth. Sensing also needs bandwidth, and the reason behind this is basically this radiometer equation, which shows that the residual error in the measurement, which is the one that you want to minimize, is inversely proportional to the product of bandwidth and the observation or integration time. But sometimes you don't have a lot of observation time because your phenomenon is dynamic, because you have limited observation windows and so on. So having large bandwidth is important. And in addition, you have physical phenomena in specific bands, as we'll see later, that need to be tracked and sensed in both specific bands. So the question really becomes, how can we make sure that multiple technologies and multiple services that rely on the wireless spectrum can get what they want, so more spectrum, while avoiding the silos and the fragmentation that will affect spectrum today and that we have seen in the previous slide. And this is what is driving my research. I call this as basically a vision toward open spectrum systems, where we can leverage efficient and dynamic spectrum access system, and in particular with the goal to expand spectrum access. And in particular, in my research and also in the remaining part of this talk, I focused on 3 ways to expanding this kind of spectrum access. So the first is new spectrum for wireless networks. As you may know, 5G and 6G cellular networks are looking at new frequencies, for example, millimeter wave and terahertz band. And here I applied basically the idea of end-to-end optimization, where I try to create networks that are reliable, robust, and provide quality of services for end-to-end flows, and not just focusing on a single portion, for example, on the physical layer. The second area is coexistence in the same spectrum. So how can different services use the same portion of the spectrum? And here I focused on a new problem that we're gonna see better in a moment, that is dynamic sharing above 100 gigahertz, and also on intelligent neutral host applications for cellular networks. And the third and final thread is basically more efficient spectrum systems. How can you do more with the limited resources that you have now? And for this, I applied basically some new AI and ML techniques on top of the intelligent Open RAN paradigm. And a thread that connects these 3 areas, basically the foundation for my research, has been also the development of analysis, open source simulation tools, which are available to the research community, and the development, maintenance, and usage of experimental testbeds, like, for example, some testbeds that we have here at Northeastern that I help managing and that are publicly available to the community. So this said, I'll turn into the second part of the presentation, where I'll briefly describe one study in each of these areas. And of course, it's a very high-level introduction, so if you have any question, I'll be happy to take them during the Q&A. Let's start from the consideration on new spectrum for wireless networks. As I mentioned, 5G and 6G are looking for 2 millimeter waves and sub-terahertz frequency bands to provide communication services. And the challenge here is to really provide reliable services while supporting the harsh propagation environment. And one of the techniques that has been identified to basically improve the link budget in this communication environment is using beamforming. So the transmitter and the receiver focus their energy in narrow beams and help improving the link budget. However, to experience the optimal beamforming gain, the transmitter and the receiver need to point toward each other during the communication, during the initial access, but also after they are connected to each other. And this is often a time-consuming process. I did an analysis of basically different paradigms for initial access in 3GPP NR, and there are configurations with which it takes easily more than hundreds of milliseconds. And the reason behind this is because traditionally these beam management schemes rely on periodic pilots that are transmitted sequentially and directionally by the base station, and on the receiver basically estimating channel qualities on these periodic pilots, which, for example, in 3GPP NR are SS blocks. So this basically introduces high latency and overhead. So in this paper that is called Deep Beam, and I presented at Mobioc 2021, what the goal has been to use deep learning on the IQ samples at the receiver to do angle of arrival identification and transmit beam identification, with the idea that you can use these two pieces of information to replace the exhaustive scan that you see at the top, and to do this by exploiting ongoing data transmissions to our users, so without the explicit need for pilots. And how do we do this? This deep beam framework is the first one that leverages waveform learning in the millimeter wave domain, and specifically IQ-based learning to do classification that is connected to problems in the millimeter wave domain. Where the first, so IQ-based learning is a technique that exploits imperfections in the IQ plane that are introduced by, for example, RF chains, power amplifiers, or specifically in this case, phased arrays. So the phased array, to steer the energy toward a specific direction, basically needs to change the phase shift in each of its elements. And this introduces some imperfection, some slight imperfection in the IQ plane that can be captured by a convolutional neural network. So what Deep Beam does is, first it learns, it eavesdrops ongoing transmissions, and it associates through deep learning the transmit beam from the codebook with a certain channel quality metrics, for example, SNR. The second step is it estimates the angle of arrival using similar procedures and with a single RF chain. And the first step is it uses these two pieces of information to perform adaptation. So we actually run a data collection campaign with multiple radios, so with Sci-beam and NI radios and Pi radio radios, to basically validate whether this is a phenomenon that was because of something that was in a certain data set that we were using, or also to, for example, check if this is generic. And the dataset and code are available on this website, deepbeam.net, and are being using, for example, right now by an ITU competition as a reference dataset. So what we've shown is actually that learning the beam pattern is something that is possible, and that a convolutional neural network can effectively distinguish beams in a codebook. And then we show through analysis that this allows to reduce the initial access in HBPNR. Okay, so this wraps the first thread, and let's move to the second one, which is basically coexistence in the same spectrum. And the idea here, the challenge, is to make different services coexist in the same frequency bands. And specifically, I focused in a new portion of the spectrum, at least new for communications people, which is the spectrum above 100 gigahertz, which is considered for 6G backhaul, basically. And the idea here is that 6G backhaul will need a large bandwidth, and potentially we could find this bandwidth above 100 gigahertz. However, the problem is that there are several narrow bands that are exclusively allocated to passive sensing, and we cannot interfere over these bands. So the question that I try to solve is, how can we enable new 6G services and sensing at the same time, and possibly also expand the bands where sensing can happen? And the framework that I developed to do this is basically an experimental platform for the first experimental platform for dynamic spectrum sharing above 100 gigahertz, where we basically prototype a transmitter and a receiver that are dual band in the sub-terahertz band and can adapt in real time to avoid interference. And so we basically prototype this and demonstrate it on top of some Northeastern buildings, and we recently published this in a Nature Communication Engineering paper. The third topic that I would like to briefly cover is how we can design more efficient spectrum systems, so do more with what we have. And here the challenge is to use the limited portions more efficiently. And one possible solution that we identified is to use data-driven approaches. So to basically adapt the network configuration to the actual conditions that you see on the network in real time. And specifically, we focused on the the Oran architecture and some components of the Oran architecture, the run intelligent controllers, which can host custom intelligence and control the base stations in the network. And
5
so,
minutes.
Yep. Along this line, we have developed basically a set of data-driven spectrum systems that use these custom applications, which are called XApps and RApps in the RICs, to perform a set of different optimizations. For example, resource management, so slicing and scheduling with actor-critic deep reinforcement learning and autoencoders. Then we did mobility management or traffic steering using conservative TPQ learning. And we also studied how we can optimally allocate these AI and ML bits in the network so that we can provide the best service for the end users. And we did this also by basically developing a platform that is now publicly available and used by people that use these kind of systems that allows us to develop the end-to-end flow for AI and ML in Oran, starting from the creation of datasets to the design, training, and packaging of machine learning solution for Oran, and the testing on wireless experimental platform. And this that you have at the bottom is a high-level diagram of all the components that are involved, which map the Oran architecture that I showed you before. So going to the conclusion, I hope that with this high-level presentation, I showed you that it is possible to design a new generation of spectrum systems, which are more open, more efficient, more adaptive, and based, for example, on sharing paradigms. And to do this, you need some coordination, you need end-to-end design, you need experimental results. And but the overall conclusion is that it is possible to design this kind of system. In addition, I really think that the time to work on these spectrum issues, especially spectrum issues for 6G, is now. So part of this research that I have done has resulted in the contribution to some standardization bodies, like the Oran Alliance, and pre-standardization, like the Next G Alliance, into profiles, experimental profiles that are available on Colosseum, comments that we send to FCC and NTIA, and also in a commercialization activity through a Northeastern University spin-off. So this concludes my presentation. I really need to acknowledge NSF and OUSD, who have recently funded a couple of grants where I'm co-PI, and the W8 Industry Consortium, and especially my colleagues at Northeastern and beyond, who are helping me translating this from a vision to a set of actual technologies. Thank you very much.
Okay, Michele, thanks. Now is the time for the question from the jury. So I'll start with a question, then Aldo, and then Anna. So I have a question on the first topic that you have covered, which is the AI-enabled beam management. Okay, and so I have a question. So when doing the experiments, did you also add a look into the energy requirements by the UE or in general, sensors?
That's a very good question, because if you have to eavesdrop and listen to the ongoing transmissions, then it means that you have to consume some energy, and you also have to process the data inside the CNN. So we did not consider this specifically, but something that we did was basically implementing the CNN architecture on an FPGA architecture. It's often a very efficient and not very energy demanding architecture that can be embedded on mobile devices. So we did that mainly to profile the latency, but it's also something that can help in terms of energy efficiency.
But you need also to send those pilots, right?
So with Deep Beam, the idea is that you actually avoid transmitting the pilots from the base station, right? Because you eavesdrop on the ongoing transmission. So that is an area where you can spare some energy, and the other is you decrease the time it takes for this procedure. So you immediately go into a connected mode, which is a more efficient mode because you already know where to steer and how to talk basically with the base station.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Aldo, do you have a question?
Yes, just a quick question on the same first topic,
Sure.
this Deep Beam. I'm just curious, when you do this training, I mean, this training of the convolutional neural network, does it happen through different channel realization? I mean, how can you handle time-varying channels, for example, or fading?
Yeah. That's a good question. So what we did was basically collecting data over multiple days and also over multiple locations in the same room and over different rooms and with different radio front ends. And then we basically organize this data so that there are sequences that are that corresponds to data that has been collected in a short time interval, but we also mix it up so that we have sequences from different days and sequences from different location or, for example, different radio front ends. By doing this mixing, we basically show that it is possible to improve the robustness with respect to something that you have not seen in your training.
So it is robust against this variation due to fading. And
we were really curious, like, are we learning this because of some channel configuration or because we are
exactly. That was my point. Yeah,
we are doing this learning of the IQ imperfection based on the beam, and we did this data collection on purpose with different configuration with the obstacle to change the channel conditions and verify that actually you are learning what you are learning and not the wireless channel in between the two endpoints.
Good, thank you.
Okay, Anna, you have a question?
Yeah, just a very quick question. Can you just give us a bit more details on the vision behind the 6G?
Yeah, that's a kind of a broad question, and I've been focusing on some components related to 6G. And one of the papers that I wrote basically has summarized some of the technology trends and some of the use cases behind this technology. And some at the high level, so each generation of mobile networks improves some communication physical layer components. And for 6G, people are really looking at the basically sub-terahertz or basically lower 100 gigahertz domain. There is a lot of discussion on 140 gigahertz, either for backhaul or for access. Another trend is basically this thing that I mentioned related to open RAN system, more open and programmable networks, basically to complete this vision that has started in 5G, but is still developing. So basically having programmable networks also in the wireless domain. And the final trend is probably that of sustainability. So we are trying to improve KPIs in terms of throughput, in terms of latency, and so on. And we started with 4G and 5G to deploy denser and denser network, but you arrive at a certain point where you really need to think about how sustainable is the operation of your network. So these at the very high level are, let's say, some of the macro areas where people are focusing on, including the Next Alliance, which is doing some pre-standardization activities here in the US.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then I would like to thank Michele for the for the nice presentation. I would like to thank the finalists and the jury. Now I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Maggie Phillips Gerla, representing the family of Mario. And I would like to leave the floor to Maggie to say a few words.
Good morning, everyone. At least it's morning in California. I'm just back from Italy, so I'm a bit jet lagged. So if you don't mind, I've written a few notes that I just want to be sure to say. I want to congratulate first these excellent scholars, Valeria, Marzia, Michele. Our family is really honored to sponsor an award for such rising stars in computer science in the Italian diaspora. And you all really represent that community right now. I'm especially pleased that you're active at the cutting edge of your fields, that you exhibit a creative approach to important research questions, that you pursue your work in interdisciplinary settings, which is becoming so much more important, and also that you display a passion for your work. Thanks to the internet, you all know of that, I was able to read a bit about each of you, and I'm delighted to learn that in your work in your life, you each live values that Mario also is known for. your collegiality, your commitment to mentoring, your active pursuit of outside interests. If any of you had met Mario, you'd know he's a fanatic sports, well, he was a fanatic sports person. He was a traveler. He loved the arts. He was incredibly eclectic. And more generally, he exhibited a joie de vivre, or I should say, joia de vivere, that all of you, I can feel, have too. I wish you all continued success and joy in your work and your lives. I know Mario would be pleased to know that you're continuing his legacy. And finally, I want to also thank Elisa and Aldo and Anna for once again agreeing to serve on the jury for this award. Your careful and your diligent work assures that there's consistency in the quality of candidates and in the award winners across these years. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maggie, thank you for your very enthusiastic words. Okay, we all feel very motivated by you. And of course, we are always happy to think about Mario and the impact that he has had on our field. So with this, I think I like to conclude the symposium. And so at this point, the jury will discuss, and I guess I will see you in the ceremony in Washington.
Thank you. Looking forward.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.